Well, welcome to the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation. I am your host, Ben Shetler, and I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled today to have someone that I regularly follow, one of my favorite people to follow on social media. Both my wife and I, Natasha Crain, is on the show. Natasha is a podcaster. She is a blogger. She is an author. You'll see her work even featured on Focus on the Family. She has an incredible conference that she does with Frank Turek and Alyssa Childers called Unshaken Faith. And today we're going to talk about the important topic of discernment. How do we as believers think biblically about the issues we are facing? And that's something I love to talk about, is how do we think biblically? That's why the Biblical Worldview Show exists. And Natasha has a very special gift to look at what's happening, to think biblically about that, and then to even provide other believers a kind of a map and a roadmap to thinking biblically about what's happening in culture. So please welcome to the Biblical Worldview Show, Natasha Crain.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, and thank you for such a kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's great to talk with you.
All right, Natasha, we have lots of questions, but just kind of by way of introducing people to what you do and what you're doing, I was kind of curious as far as like equipping believers on worldview topics. Why is that so important to you? If you can, so if you haven't followed the Biblical Worldview Show on Facebook, you can go and do that. And after you do that, go right to Natasha's page and follow her. And I would say of all the platforms, you can follow her on Twitter, Instagram, but especially Facebook. She has a lot of stuff. I feel like that's kind of her main space. But I get that when I follow you, I get that feeling that you are passionate about it. Why is this important, Natasha?
Well, just to give a little backstory of how I got to finding it to be so important, I started a blog back in 2011. So in 2011, everyone was starting blogs. I thought, oh, I can do that. That sounds interesting. That sounds fun. I had 3 kids who were 3 and under at the time. It was kind of a little side project that I could do. And so I called it Christian Mom Thoughts. Really wasn't thinking twice about, what to name it. I never planned on writing or speaking or anything like that, certainly. And when I started my blog, soon after, I started getting attacked by people who were coming by skeptics who would leave comments, and they were just kind of making fun of what I was doing, and not just making fun of what I was doing as a Christian mom, talking about things that we were doing to teach our young kids about Jesus, but also challenging things about Christianity over time. So making claims about how there's no evidence that God exists, there's no evidence that Jesus was even a person in history, that the Bible is filled with errors and contradictions, all these kinds of claims. And so as those things came across my blog, I started to realize I have no idea how to answer these questions. I grew up in a Christian home. I had always been a Christian, but I had never been confronted with challenges like that. And so I realized my kids are growing up just in a completely different world than the one in which I grew up. And that's how I discovered apologetics, how you make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity. Had never heard the word before 2011. It wasn't anything on my radar whatsoever. And I just, one by one, as these kinds of challenges came across my site, I started just digging in online and doing some research and started to read some books and learning about these things. And it started to ignite a passion for me because I couldn't believe that all those years in church, that I had never really been confronted with these things, that no one had said, hey, these are the things that you're going to hear. Here's what you should know as a Christian. No one had ever said that. It wasn't something that we talked about in my home either, even though I had wonderful, loving Christian parents. It just wasn't a thing for us. And so long story short, my blog sort of exploded in growth once I started writing about those subjects, because once I would learn things, I would turn around and then blog about them. So I would write articles and say, hey, this is the kind of thing people are saying. This is what you should know so you can teach your kids. And that led to me writing 3 apologetics books for parents to help parents understand how do you talk to your kids about these things, and really just put the challenges in front of them, because half the time it's not just not knowing the answers. They didn't even know the questions. Those are my first 3 books. And then by the time we got to 2020, I started seeing a lot of crazy stuff going on in culture, as did the rest of us. And I had been very focused on resources specifically for parents up until that time. But in 2020, I decided, I have to say something about what's going on. There were all these
Agreed.
secular ideas that were pouring into what should be the biblical worldview of Christians, and people were really getting confused. And so I wrote this blog post, and I can't remember the exact title, something like 5 ways Christians are getting swept into a secular worldview in this cultural moment, I think is what it was. And it went viral, and it was liked and shared hundreds of thousands of times. And I realized, wow, people really do want to learn more about how to think biblically about all things. There's a lot of non-biblical thought going on. And so that led to me actually writing more articles along the same lines in terms of the cultural issues and how do you regain biblical clarity in the midst of a secular culture. So, not so much apologetics, but just worldview wise, what's
Yeah.
consistent with having a biblical worldview? What's consistent with a secular worldview? What even is a secular worldview? How do we keep those apart? That led to my fourth book, which is called Faithfully Different. That was the last book that I did that was subtitled exactly that, Regaining Biblical Clarity in a Secular Culture. So that's the long answer to your question about why I'm passionate about it. It started with zero understanding of these topics, sort of accidentally getting into it because of things that I was hearing through my blog that brought me into apologetics. That led to sort of more of a worldview focus a few years ago. And now I kind of abridge both of those worlds with apologetics and worldview. And I have a new one coming out, a new book coming out in March of next year.
Which is called
When Culture Hates You. And the subtitle is Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. So it's all about public engagement. What does it look like for the Christian to engage in a public square where culture is becoming very dark? How do we be light even when people hate us?
I love that title so much. If you're open to it when the book is out, I'd love for you to come back on the show at all. And I think we will have my wife Mackenzie on that show as well because she's such a big fan of yours, as I am. But if you're open to it, I not to put you on the spot, but I love that title because I think there's a lot of Christians. For a long time, we thought if we do this right, if we speak truth and love the right way, nobody's going to hate us. And so we measured culture. We have been measuring for decades the effectiveness on cultural engagement based on the response of the culture. And now we cannot do that anymore. And we probably should have never been doing that. And that's where I think you see a lot of this shift from, Keller in the 90s to Keller right before he passed. I don't want to get into trouble with too many names, but even you take somebody like Russell Moore, who is way off in left field right now. Whereas, like, if you go back to 2014, he had the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission doing a conference that we attended that was so helpful to me called The Gospel, Homosexuality, and the Future of Marriage, which is something he would never do now. And I think what happened was, as culture said, we will not even allow you to hold those positions. And so they said, well, then we've got to change the position. And so how do you do now? What do you do when culture hates you? And that's going to be a helpful book. It's going to be good. How far in are you?
Well, the book is written, so it's all done. It's all turned into the publisher, so it will come out March 11th. It's available for pre-order. But yeah,
Great.
I really do hope that it is helpful for a lot of people. And you hit on something so important, what you just said, in that a lot of Christians gauge their effectiveness and even their faithfulness by the response of others to what they're saying and doing. But we have to understand that Jesus said that the world would hate his followers because if you were of the world would embrace you as one of its own. But if you're not of the world, then the world is going to hate you. And so that's really the challenge here. And so many times I've gotten the question from Christians, how can we better engage so that people don't hate us? And I always say that's the wrong question, because the Bible already says that the world will hate you. The world will hate when you are shining light in the darkness. That is just the truth. And so what you want to make sure is you're not being a jerk, as your ministry says, truth and love, right? Well, you don't want to be jerks. We don't want to be ungracious. We want to listen
Yeah.
well. We want to understand other people's positions. We want to be good communicators. All of that. Yes, 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 yes.
Mm.
But Christians need to understand that you can do all of those things really well and still have people hate you because of the message itself. The gospel is offensive because it tells people that the authority in your life is not you, it's God. And people hate that.
Ooh.
God is the
Mm.
boss. He's the
Mm.
authority. He's the one who gets to
Mm.
say what is right or wrong, good or bad, harmful or helpful. Only He does. You can make up your own view of the world. You can start making up your own understanding of those things. But at the end of the day, you're not actually the authority. It's God who is.
Yeah,
And so
it is.
the entire message that we have is offensive. We don't want to be offensive as a person, but the message is offensive. So we cannot judge whether or not we're doing our job well as Christians by people's response. We need to judge according to the
Yeah.
standard of what the Bible teaches about sharing truth and love.
Well said. Well, and we that's how you get, like, how do you wake up and go, wait a second, why is all of culture praising me as a Christian? And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm gonna start mentioning names, and names aren't the point. The point is as believers, I just think of people right now that I'm like, wow, you really have drifted because you are measuring your engagement based on what the culture says about you, and that cannot be the measurement. So true. This, the hardest part of this interview is going to be not adding to what Natasha says. All right, so question number 2, do you think the spiritual gift of discernment is something that has been viewed negatively in church circles and in Christianity? I tend to feel it has a little bit.
Oh, it absolutely has. And sometimes, to be fair, sometimes we can get to the end of legalism, right? Where it's like every single thing we're trying to nitpick and we're trying to find something
Mm.
wrong and kind of, hunting for heresies, as sometimes people say, that kind of thing. But on the other end of the spectrum, you see people who are just fatigued. I think a lot of Christians are tired because they realize how much there is that needs discernment in culture. And sometimes people are just kind of throwing up their hands and saying, I'm tired. And I see that in Facebook groups that
Mm.
I manage, for example, who are just like, do we really need to be concerned about whether we sing this song or that song, for example? That was a big discussion in my Facebook group, Faithfully Different, this week. And so people, I do think, are tired sometimes from the discernment.
Yeah.
And other times they just don't realize the need for it. And that's what concerns me, is that, I've seen Christians over time, for example, say, why do we have to care so much about something like critical theory? Isn't it just a tool? Isn't it just like one way of viewing the world? Like, do we really need to get that crazy about it in the church? Because I see, several people, including myself, who are saying, no, this is actually a really significant problem when Christians bring in these ideas because it's fundamentally in conflict with Christianity. And they kind of shrug their shoulders and they go, right? I
Yeah.
don't know. And you get criticized for being discerning about biblical justice versus social justice. So in those cases, it is challenging because I understand the desire to not be legalistic, but at the same time, just because someone might not realize the need for talking about a given subject doesn't mean that that subject is not important. Sometimes
Yeah.
it means you just don't know yet how important it is. And I don't say that as
Oh,
someone
that's good.
preaching to other people. I've experienced that myself. In fact, even, I mean, I speak so much on the whole neo Marxist platform and ideas that we see in culture and all of its manifestations today. I mean, I am passionate about educating the church on why this is
Yeah.
such a problem. Well, a few years ago, there was a new book that came out, and I can't remember the title right off the top of my head, but it was by Jeff Myers, who's the president of Summit Ministries. And I was already well into apologetics at this point when this book came out. And I remember reading about the different worldviews that he laid out in this book. And one of them was Marxism. And at that point, this was prior to 2020. At this point, I really didn't know what was going on with that whole thing. And I remember just thinking, Marxism, what a strange thing to include in a book on
Mm.
worldviews. I mean,
Mm.
that's Marx, that was like 1800s, right? And I really
Mm.
didn't get it. And I saw what he was writing about it, but it didn't click for me. I didn't think it was particularly important as a worldview because I just didn't have the knowledge. So when 2020 comes around and now I start getting introduced to critical theory and, oh, this is what's going on behind the whole
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter thing. This is what drives it. This is the worldview. These are the presuppositions. Once I start seeing all of those things, I go, wow, he saw this a long time before I did. I didn't appreciate that particular point at the time because I just didn't understand. And so
Mm.
It happens to all of us. This is not to point
Yeah.
fingers at
Yeah.
anyone, but rather to say, if somebody is listening and thinks, sometimes Christians are making too much out of certain issues, they might be making too much out of certain issues, or they might not be. Sometimes you just
Mm.
need more background and more understanding on a given problem before you know those things. So it's always worth learning more, educating yourself, equipping yourself, not just for you, but so that you can educate others. Because if you're the one who takes the time to learn, you can educate and equip people in your church, your friends, all around you who might not otherwise take that time themselves.
Yeah. That you really helped me think through people that like sometimes I do get frustrated because I'm like, no, this is really important. And I think that helped me realize, um, maybe people just don't understand. And one thing our ministry has a lot of traction with is Christian educators, and there's a lot of Christian educators that listen to this podcast. And I think the reason for that is because many of them are seeing the like even second and third grade teachers are seeing the types of things that their students are interacting with because they're with them so frequently. And I will say, strangely enough, pastors are more insulated than they realize. And so it's like sometimes I like there are some pastors that don't realize how ubiquitous these ideas are in corporate America. They are in the education system because they're interacting with people that are very removed from those. And so yeah, that's really true. Like sometimes we don't realize the need for them until we actually encounter it. I would also add in First Thessalonians 5, that's like the passage I always ran to as a kid, like if you need like short verses to memorize, because that's the pray without ceasing and everything give thanks. Like these are short verses so you can get lots of points when you're at camp or whatever. But one of them is despise not prophesying. And there's a lot of cessationists that have said, well, prophesying is foretelling. And I think scripturally prophesying is includes the foretelling, but I think some of it is just the seeing. A prophet is a seer. And I think there are people that are able to discern what's happening and what's going on. And if we go, oh, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to. Now, sometimes prophets don't speak in love, right? Like they're not, but the reality is if someone is going like, hey, Marxism is a threat to the church, that should be at least, especially among leadership, at least be thought of going like, maybe this person has a reason for why they're saying we really shouldn't call God's love reckless. Maybe there's a nature to God's love, and maybe we shouldn't sing this song because when we look at scripture, it really doesn't echo what scripture says about the love of God. And that's meaningful because when you're 40 and understand the love of God and have that solidified, that's great. But when you're 12, that may mean something very different to you when you use that terminology. And so we've got to be careful to not despise prophesying, as scripture says.
That's
Um,
a really good example too, I think, with the whole reckless love thing, because sometimes there are things that you like people would all look at and say, yeah, that is bad theology, right? They'll all look at the same thing but say, but it's not a big deal. And so the other thing that sometimes people will see is all the implications that can come from something. So maybe we don't necessarily see it ourselves, but maybe somebody else points out, hey, that just is the beginning of the chain of some bad
mhm,
theology, and
yeah,
little bits of bad theology actually hurt people.
yeah,
And I think that there are songs. I mean, it happens everywhere. It happens sometimes in my church. It happens in other churches. There are songs that we sing where you're singing along, and all of a sudden you go, that's not exactly right.
mm.
And I wish I could remember the song that just came to me the other day, where it was like, um, I something that uh, it was something
What
about
was
how
the one you
God.
guys were discussing on Faithfully Different? What song?
Um, I don't think so, but it was kind of like he answered, and that's why I trust him, something like that. And it was kind of
Mm,
like, is praising God for I called out and he answered me, and that's why I trust him. Well, we trust in God because of who he is, because of his
mm,
character, not
yeah,
because any particular response to our prayer requests.
yeah,
Sometimes we pray for things that aren't for the best for us,
yeah.
even if we think it
That's good.
is. And sometimes it's really,
That's
really
good.
hard to accept that we might be praying for something that seems like an obvious good that
Yeah,
God doesn't answer
that
in
is
the way
good.
that we want. So if people start believing that actually, that's why I trust him, when you have a whole church that is singing along to those words, I can't help but stand there and think, how many people here right now are thinking, well, he hasn't answered my prayer in the way that I hoped. I'm still grappling with something really difficult right now. He hasn't answered. Should I not trust him? And it's good for all these people. I'm glad they can trust him, but I don't if that's what it means to trust. So sometimes, in the context of discernment, sometimes we look at those little things like, oh, reckless love, or that's why I trust him. We think that's not a big deal. But sometimes if people are warning about songs or anything else, I'm just using songs as an example, sometimes it's because they have more exposure to seeing the end result of those things and how they play out over time with bad theology. So little bits of bad theology can do really big damage.
And what I've noticed, that's so well said. What I've noticed is in the church, we really value the person that is there for us, that gift of mercy in our time. So our life's falling apart and that person came and put their arm around me and they prayed for me. And that is a valuable gift to the church, the gift of mercy. But we have to also begin to value the gift of the person that says, hey, I'm not trying to be legalistic. I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm telling you that in the long term, what we're saying here is wrong and it will have effects. That gift also needs to be exercised within the body of Christ. And those who have the gift need to be careful of how we like we need to be kind and loving, but at the same time we have to be, oh, you know what, I need to think about that. And well, how do I do that? How do I think about what's happening in culture specifically? We're going to take a break. And when we come back, more with Natasha Crain on how to discern what is happening in culture. You're watching the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation. When it comes to Gen Z, you're actually talking about a generation that could impact the world in terms of technology, possibilities, in a way that no generation ever has. But also when you're talking about Gen Z, this is a generation that doesn't know how to find the truth. They don't know how to disagree. They don't understand human identity. They don't know how to fail. And they don't know how to use the Bible as an external creed. And so when people look at these problems, I feel like they kind of diagnose it one of two ways. On one hand, they recognize that we are in a truly apocalyptic scenario with Generation Z and the lies that are being pushed on them to a point where this will upend all of culture. And then on the other hand are people that tend to be a little bit of deniers. They say, well, Gen Z faces these issues, but it's not really as bad. Times have always been bad. It is very true that there is significant dangers facing Gen Z. But it is not true that there is nothing that we can do about it. And so at the Center for Truth and Love, we created this resource that we believe will help you understand the lies and the challenges that Gen Z is facing while equipping you to faithfully know what the Bible says and how you can lead them through those challenges. Welcome back. I am so excited to have Natasha Crain, author, speaker, podcaster. Definitely find her on Facebook or other social media platforms, some phenomenal books. I apologize. I should have written this down ahead of time. Your upcoming book that is available for pre-order now, Natasha, the name of it.
It's called When Culture Hates You. That's the title. That's the easier part to memorize. The subtitle is Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. But it's a lot easier to say When Culture Hates You.
When Culture Hates You. As soon as I'm done with this, I'm going to go and pre-order. I didn't know. I know you've been talking about it. I'm going to go and pre-order that. Very excited about it.
Thank you.
Okay, so when culture does hate us, I want to get specifically more to discernment. And as I followed you, you sometimes use this, and I went on your social media page yesterday, just as I was kind of preparing for this, and you posted about why Christians need to speak about abortion specifically. And you mentioned the state I live in, the state of Florida. We have an amendment on the ballot. I'm not sure that this will air before that, but we have an amendment on the ballot that is basically abortion anytime for any reason. And Christians need to say, hey, this is wrong. We need to speak against it. Our churches need to say, hey, We can't allow unborn lives to be killed. But there's a process that I call, and you may have a better term for this, but I call it demonstrating the logical flaw. So if something is untrue, we can look at the world that God made and go, wait a second, that's not consistent with the world that God made. And the way you did this specifically on abortion was you took it out of the context of a baby in the womb. And maybe you'd be willing to talk about that. And maybe you have a better term than demonstrating the logical flaw for the way you discern things happening in a culture.
Well, I think that term is fine. I don't have a replacement term for it or anything like that. I think sometimes I refer to things as taking things to the natural conclusions, which is kind of the similar perspective, I guess, on that. But I was just saying in that post, can you imagine the uproar that there would be in our culture if there was a group of people who were advocating for the right for people to kill their toddlers anytime they wanted? Imagine that there were kids who just disappeared from your neighborhood periodically, and everyone kind of had to go, yeah, I guess they didn't want little Mark anymore, and so he's not with us. Imagine your kids come home from preschool and it's like, oh, did you have a good back to school first day of school? Well, Kelsey's not there. Her parents didn't want her anymore. I mean, just imagine if you regularly saw this happening and there was a whole group of people who were advocating for that. Everyone would say, I don't care what else they stand for. If they're advocating for that and they're celebrating that, you can't support that. This is crazy. Everyone would be, everyone would be outraged. The only difference with abortion is that you don't see the kids disappear because they're on the inside of a womb. That's it. And if that is really it. And so if you are talking with someone and you kind of put that scenario in front of them, I've heard it called trot out the toddler, for example, that you bring out the toddler example. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who would say, no, I'm okay, I'd be okay with the whole toddler thing. If that's the case, and they're an atheist, they have a naturalistic worldview, there's no moral law, they believe everything's truly relative, if they're gonna it's almost impossible to find somebody like this. But I'm just saying, if they're completely consistent within their atheism in that way, then that's not a conversation about abortion. They're being consistent with that within their own worldview. That's an apologetics question of how do we know which worldview is correct?
Yeah.
You're being consistent. I'm being consistent. Now, how do we break the tie about who's actually right about the nature of reality? That's different. But the thing today is that people overwhelmingly are inconsistent within their own worldview. They take a lot of ideas from the Christian worldview that has been predominant in our country, so we have this whole Christian heritage. They take these ideas and now they have their own ideas of God where, oh yeah, I believe God is loving and I believe that he's all knowing and I pray to God. I mean, the vast majority of people do. The research shows this. It's not that people overwhelmingly have discarded God. They've overwhelmingly discarded a God who has revealed himself in the Bible so that now they can have a God of their own making, but they have no objective basis for knowing anything about that God. So it's really helpful, I think, when you're talking about cultural issues with people to understand that if Christianity is true, then you're going to be able to show the logical flaw. I think you call it demonstrating the logical flaw. You're going to be able to show the logical flaw in their worldview because it's going to conflict with reality, unless, like I said, they're a full-on atheist who knows how to take those presuppositions to their natural conclusions. And it's I've come across maybe one or two people who at least attempt to do that. But most of the time, people have this whole idea about God and morality that they have no objective basis for knowing anything about. I always tell people, for example, lots of people believe that there's a God. In fact, about 90% of people in America believe that there's a God, and they'll claim to know a whole lot about him. But if he never revealed himself, if there's no revealed scripture, whether that's a Book of Mormon or the Quran or the Bible, if he never revealed himself, this God, this creator of the universe, you don't know anything about him. You can't claim what he would or would not do. You can't claim that he would love all people. You can't claim that he doesn't love people with freckles more than others. You don't know anything about him. You are just assuming that you do, that you know something about morality, that you know what he approves of and disapproves of. How do you know? What's your basis for knowing that? And I think when you really push people on that, they start to say, well, I just, they'll say things like, well, I just know, or we all know, or I don't need anything more than that to know. Well, how do you know? So pushing people on that while assuming the truth of Christianity will show you the flaws in their argument so that you can ask them, How do you know that? How did you come to your conclusions?
Oh, those are two powerful questions. So rather than going, you're wrong, a great response, so well said, is how did you come to that conclusion? Like, walk me through that. And one of the popular phrases in our culture is "Don't judge me." And I break this down in a lecture that I give, and I talk about like going to the grocery store, or going to Walmart, and then not checking out. And will I identify as a non-paying person? And so then I roll out to the parking lot, and the police show up, and I'm like, well, I identify as non-paying. I get anxiety when I pay, and so that anxiety clearly, and the police are like, well, that you're going to jail. You stole this stuff. And then I say, who are you to judge me? And obviously, we've taken it to its logical conclusion there. The same with I like if you grasped imagining in your neighborhood, like it almost, I know it's hypothetical, but it brings me to tears to imagine the kids across my street, their parents go, hey, we just got rid, and of course their parents love them, they would never do that, but that thought is so powerful. And these are important ways. There's a few others, and I couldn't remember them off the top of my head, so I'm gonna, like, some other things like that, Natasha, that you're like, oh, this was something that I've dealt with recently, and here's a way that I think there was something like when the RNC came out, I feel like I remember you saying like, hey, here's something to think about. Are there any other examples of this, taking something to its natural conclusion, that could apply to some of the issues we're facing right now?
Well, the one that comes to mind, I don't know, it's probably not the same thing that you happen to be thinking of right now, but what comes to mind is something I talk about in When Culture Hates You, which is, when people have objections to Christian involvement in the political realm,
Mm,
always try to put that objection and frame it in light of slavery. And I call this the slavery test in my book, because everyone today, nearly everyone, would agree that slavery was a horrible thing. It doesn't matter where you are worldview wise, doesn't matter where you are politically. This is like a common point we can all converge on. Slavery was evil. It was a good thing. We should all agree it's a good thing that we got rid of slavery. Okay, so we found a universal point there that we can agree on. Well, take some of these objections to Christian political involvement and now put them in the light of slavery. I'll give you an example.
mm,
When people say, hey, Christians, why are you imposing your values on other people? Well, would you ever say, we shouldn't have banned slavery because that imposed some people's values
mm,
on
mm,
other people's? That makes no sense. We would never say that today. Or someone might say, Jesus gave up his power on the cross, so we as Christians shouldn't seek political power. Well, if you apply the slavery test to that, would anyone ever say, we shouldn't have gotten rid of slavery because Jesus gave up his power on the cross? It's a total non sequitur. And yet,
yeah.
this is a theme that you see in what a lot of people say
Mm,
today about power and the nature of it. We would say, no, it's actually a good thing that those who had the power to do so acted on it. They used power well, they stewarded it for good, and therefore slavery was eliminated via the 13th
mm,
Amendment. So, it's one thing for all these people to have mantras in the church today about, oh, Christians are grasping for political power, and Jesus, he didn't tell us to go and take over the Roman Empire. They use all these examples, but if you put them in light of slavery, and you say, would you have said because Jesus didn't try to take over the Roman Empire, therefore we shouldn't have banned slavery? It doesn't make any sense. There's no connection there. And so when you start to put it in that light, I think it helps people to see, okay, well, maybe we need to talk about this in a little bit more of a nuanced way and not just say, oh, we shouldn't impose our values on people, or, we shouldn't seek power. Let's get rid of the mantras and actually talk about what it looks like to have positive engagement in the public square. So that's why I wanted to write that book.
Oh, excellent. The slavery test. That is so good. And that's what I was looking for. Yeah. Something like, and I think you call them tests a lot of times because once again, you're testing it. You're going, okay, if this is true, then that means down here, this is true. And it does. It demonstrates how your thinking actually is not consistent. It's not logical. It's it's true over here, but then you change it over here. What the slavery test, how helpful is that? Natasha, thank you for being on this episode. We're going to pause and then we'll add a few more in part 2. If you're watching this in 2 parts, if it hasn't dropped, you'll have to wait a week. If it has dropped, jump right over to episode 2. You're watching the Biblical Worldview Show, a ministry of RenewaNation. Definitely check us out online at RenewaNation.org, or check out the Center for Truth and Love.org. Follow us on Facebook, and definitely check out Natasha's newest book coming out, When Culture Hates You. You can pre-order that right now. And Natasha, thanks for being on this and for sticking around for part 2.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.